Sword Art Online fans have a very interesting relationship with reality. According to them, Sword Art Online is the most beloved anime ever made. The critics were wrong. The haters are just a vocal minority that nobody takes seriously anymore. The anime is massively successful. Everyone has finally realized that Sword Art Online was secretly a masterpiece all along. At this point, there's no need to even defend Sword Art Online anymore because it's just beating a dead horse. So if all of that is true, then why are the Sword Art Online fans still constantly complaining about all the hate the show gets? If everyone loves the show now and there's no visible hate anymore, then where's all this hate coming from? How are you seeing so much hate that you claim doesn't even exist in the first place? Apparently, Sword Art Online is simultaneously one of the most successful anime ever made that everyone loves, and the most oppressed piece of media in human history that gets way too much hate. Pick one. Either the haters are everywhere and the show is constantly under attack, or the hate is non-existent and Sword Art Online is a beloved masterpiece. Both cannot be true at the same time. You can't spend years telling everyone that the critics lost, the haters disappeared, and the anime won, only to immediately turn around and complain about those same haters every 2 minutes. It's a contradiction that sits at the center of the Sword Art Online fandom. Let's be real for a second. If there truly was no visible hate for Sword Art Online anymore, then the fans wouldn't constantly be complaining about the hate. It's really that simple. You can't spend every day talking about a problem that supposedly doesn't exist. You can't tell everyone that the haters disappeared years ago and then immediately launch into a rant about all the haters and how unfair they are. Those two positions cannot both be true at the same time. Either the hate is gone or it isn't. It's one or the other. Because every time I hear a fan say, "Nobody hates Sword Art Online anymore," it's usually followed by 5 paragraphs explaining how unjustly Sword Art Online is treated. Every time I hear, "The hate train died years ago," it's usually followed by complaints about critics, YouTube videos, forum posts, Reddit discussions, or negative reviews. It's like watching someone insist that their house isn't on fire while actively running around with a fire extinguisher. The behavior completely contradicts the claim. And all of these complaints ultimately prove one thing: the criticism is still visible. It's obviously still there. Otherwise, there would be nothing to complain about in the first place. The constant obsession with the haters is basically an admission that critics still exist and that their opinions are still being seen. That's the funny part. The people trying hardest to convince everyone that Sword Art Online hate is gone are often providing the strongest evidence that it isn't gone at all. Because if criticism of Sword Art Online truly vanished, the fandom wouldn't be talking about it nonstop. There would be nothing to complain about. The discussion would have ended years ago. Instead, the topic keeps coming back again and again and again, which demonstrates that despite all the victory speeches and declarations that the critics lost, Sword Art Online fans are still bothered by what those critics have to say. The hate hits them where it hurts. It keeps them awake at night. Otherwise, they would have stopped caring and bringing them up a long time ago, but that isn't the case. Today, we're going to talk about why Sword Art Online fans seem completely incapable of letting go of a war they claim they've already won, and how they haven't won anything. They're just delusional and need to see the world as it really is.
Sword Art Online fans are constantly trying to defend this show. And that's the first thing that confuses me. Because according to Sword Art Online fans themselves, there isn't even any visible hate anymore. They'll tell you the so-called hate train died a decade ago. Okay, then what exactly are you defending Sword Art Online from? Where are you people finding all of this hate to respond to? If there are no haters, then why are there defenders everywhere? Think about it for a second. Nobody spends all day defending something that isn't being attacked. You don't see Breaking Bad fans waking up every morning and posting 20 paragraphs about why Breaking Bad is secretly good. You don't see people making endless videos explaining why The Godfather isn't actually overrated. Most fandoms spend their time talking about the things they enjoy. Sword Art Online fans seem to spend half their time talking about people who supposedly don't exist anymore. It's bizarre. Every discussion eventually circles back to the same topic. The critics were wrong. The haters misunderstood the story. The hate is forced. The hate is outdated. The hate is unfair. The hate. Did I mention the hate yet? For a fandom that insists nobody hates Sword Art Online anymore, and they're tired or addressing the hate, they sure seem obsessed with talking about people who hate Sword Art Online. It's like they're trying to convince everyone that the war ended while simultaneously acting like they're still fighting in it. And if the show is really as universally loved as they claim, then why does the fandom feel the need to constantly reassure itself that it's good? A genuinely beloved masterpiece doesn't need a permanent defense force. The fact that Sword Art Online fans are still arguing with critics from 10 years ago suggests that maybe the criticism bothered them a lot more than they're willing to admit. The hypocrisy gets even funnier when you look at how Sword Art Online fans talk to each other. One of the most common things you'll hear from Sword Art Online defenders is that defending the show is pointless. They'll tell other fans to stop arguing with critics. They'll say you're never going to change anyone's mind. They'll say haters have already made up their minds. They'll say criticism videos aren't worth responding to. And honestly, that's a perfectly reasonable position. If someone doesn't like Sword Art Online, who cares? Move on. Watch the show. Enjoy the show. Talk about the parts you like. Problem solved. But that's not what happens. Instead, the exact same people who spend hours explaining why defending Sword Art Online is pointless will immediately turn around and write a 5-page essay defending Sword Art Online. It's incredible. Apparently defending the show is a complete waste of time unless they're the ones doing it. Then suddenly it's different. Suddenly they need to explain why Kirito is actually a deep character. Suddenly they need to explain why every criticism is based on misinformation. Suddenly they need to explain why the critics didn't understand the story. Suddenly they need to explain why Sword Art Online was ahead of its time. I thought defending the show was pointless. What happened? It's like watching someone tell everybody not to jump into a swimming pool while they're already standing in the deep end. The lack of self-awareness is astonishing. And the funniest part is that they never seem to notice the contradiction. They'll spend an entire post explaining why arguing with critics is a waste of energy. Then they'll spend the next 10 paragraphs arguing with critics. At that point, you're not describing a behavior. You're actively participating in it. The reality is that many Sword Art Online fans clearly care a lot about what critics think. Far more than they're willing to admit. Because if criticism truly didn't matter, they wouldn't be spending so much time responding to it. Nobody spends years arguing against opinions they genuinely don't care about. The constant need to defend the show reveals the exact opposite of what they're trying to prove. It suggests that, deep down, the criticism still bothers them. Otherwise, they would have stopped talking about it a long time ago. It's ironic when you think about it. By constantly complaining about the hate, Sword Art Online fans are actually proving that the hate still exists. If there truly wasn't any visible criticism anymore, then there would be nothing to complain about. The topic wouldn't keep coming up. You wouldn't see endless discussions about the haters, lengthy posts about how unfair the criticism is, or videos dedicated to debunking arguments that supposedly nobody takes seriously anymore. The fact that fans keep bringing it up demonstrates that they are still seeing criticism often enough to care about it. That's what makes the whole situation so contradictory. On one hand, fans will insist that the hate train died years ago and that Sword Art Online critics are an irrelevant minority. On the other hand, they spend an enormous amount of time talking about those same critics. If the critics are truly irrelevant, why are they occupying so much space in the conversation? Why are people still writing essays, making videos, and getting into arguments over opinions that supposedly disappeared a decade ago? The behavior doesn't match the narrative. What's even funnier is that the fans themselves often provide the strongest evidence against their own claims. Every time someone says, "Nobody hates Sword Art Online anymore," and then immediately starts listing examples of people hating Sword Art Online, they've completely undermined their own argument. They've gone out of their way to prove that criticism is still visible. It's like someone insisting that a problem no longer exists while simultaneously presenting evidence that it does. The contradiction is impossible to ignore. The reality is that there are only two possibilities here. Either the criticism still exists and remains visible enough for fans to notice and complain about it, or the criticism has mostly disappeared and fans are exaggerating its presence. Either way, the claim that there's no hate anymore falls apart. If the criticism is still common enough to be a regular topic of discussion, then it obviously hasn't vanished. And if it really has vanished, then the constant complaints about it make no sense. What makes this especially strange is that most fandoms eventually move on. When fans believe their favorite series has been accepted and vindicated, they usually spend their time celebrating the series itself. They discuss the characters, the story, their favorite moments, and future releases. Sword Art Online fans, however, often seem more interested in talking about critics than the show they're supposedly passionate about. The conversation repeatedly circles back to the same topic: the haters, the critics, and the unfair treatment of Sword Art Online. In the end, all of these complaints reveal something that many fans probably don't want to admit. The criticism still bothers them. If it didn't, they wouldn't keep bringing it up. People don't spend years arguing against opinions they genuinely don't care about. The endless discussion about the hate suggests that the criticism continues to have an impact, regardless of how often fans insist that the debate is over. The more they complain about the hate, the harder it becomes to believe their claim that the hate no longer exists. Sword Art Online fans keep insisting the series doesn't need defending anymore, and that nobody even hates it now, but then spend half their time acting like they're survivors of some ongoing persecution campaign. If the hate supposedly disappeared years ago, why are the fans still obsessively shadowboxing critics that barely care anymore? Every conversation somehow circles back to Sword Art Online was unfairly hated. People only watched 3 episodes, or the internet forced people to hate it. At some point, it stops looking like confidence in the show and starts looking like a fandom that desperately needs validation. You can't simultaneously claim the series is universally respected now while constantly whining about criticism from 2014 like it's an active war zone. And the victim complex gets ridiculous. Any criticism, pacing, bland wish fulfillment writing, Kirito being an overpowered cardboard cutout, the wasted death game premise, immediately gets dismissed as bandwagon hate. Apparently, the only acceptable opinion is unconditional praise, because if someone still thinks the show has major flaws, the fandom acts like they've committed a personal attack. What makes it even funnier is that a genuinely confident fandom wouldn't care this much. Fans of actually secure series don't spend years trying to rewrite history or convince everyone the backlash was imaginary. They just enjoy the show and move on. Meanwhile, parts of the Sword Art Online fandom are still conducting PR campaigns a decade later, acting like they need to defend a multinational franchise from a couple mean tweets and old YouTube essays. At this point, the non-stop complaining about haters is more exhausting than the actual hate ever was. Sword Art Online fans are completely delusional when it comes to this topic. They constantly swear up and down that there's no hate anymore and that the series is finally accepted, but then immediately turn around and spend hours complaining about the supposed hate they claim doesn't exist. Which is it? You can't have it both ways. If the backlash truly disappeared years ago, then what exactly are you people still crying about? Imaginary critics? Ghost haters? Some random tweets with 12 likes? The fandom keeps acting like they're under siege while also insisting the war ended forever ago. It makes no sense. It feels less like actual harassment and more like certain fans are addicted to the victim narrative because it gives them an excuse to dismiss every criticism as blind hate. Someone says the writing is weak. Bandwagon hater. Someone says Kirito is bland. You just hate popular anime. Someone says the series wasted its premise. You only watched season 1. There's always an excuse ready because admitting the show has flaws would apparently shatter reality for them. The funniest part is that most people outside the fandom barely even talk about Sword Art Online anymore unless the fans themselves bring up the hate first. They're fighting shadows at this point. Nobody obsesses over Sword Art Online criticism more than Sword Art Online fans themselves. The reason is pretty obvious. A lot of Sword Art Online fans have tied their entire identity to the show. That's why even mild criticism gets treated like a personal attack. They don't just enjoy Sword Art Online. They emotionally depend on everyone else validating their taste. Normal fans can handle disagreement. If someone says they dislike a series, the response is usually fair enough and everyone moves on. But with parts of the Sword Art Online fandom, any negative opinion instantly becomes some dramatic moral issue. They act offended that people dare not worship the same anime they do. And that's why the hate discourse never dies. It's not enough for them to enjoy the show privately. They need universal approval. They need everyone to admit Sword Art Online is misunderstood genius, because the moment somebody says, "Nah, I still think it's bad," the fandom spirals into essays about elitists, bandwagon hate, and fake anime fans. Comes across as deeply insecure. If your attachment to a series is so fragile that random criticism from strangers ruins your day, then maybe the problem isn't the critics. Confident fans don't spend years desperately trying to convince the internet their favorite show is secretly flawless. That behavior usually screams the opposite. Sword Art Online fans are complete hypocrites. They love telling everyone else to stop defending the show whenever somebody points out flaws in another anime, acting like they're above blind fandom and emotional coping. But the second anyone criticizes Sword Art Online itself, they transform into full-time defense attorneys overnight. Suddenly, every bad arc is misunderstood, every plot hole is actually explained in the light novels, and every terrible writing decision becomes some deep thematic masterpiece that casual viewers just don't get. They constantly mock other fandoms for making excuses, yet they do the exact same thing with even less self-awareness. They'll spend hours whining about people overanalyzing Sword Art Online criticism while simultaneously writing essays trying to justify every inconsistent character decision and every overpowered Kirito moment. The double standard is ridiculous. According to them, defending another anime means you're delusional, but defending Sword Art Online is apparently intellectual discourse. What makes it worse is how smug they can be about it. They act like they're the rational side of the argument while behaving exactly like the obsessive fans they complain about. They'll accuse critics of hating popular anime, then immediately get defensive and hostile the moment someone points out how shallow or poorly written parts of Sword Art Online are. It's pure fandom insecurity disguised as objectivity. At the end of the day, it's clear that they don't actually hate people defending shows. They just hate when people defend shows they personally don't like. When it's Sword Art Online, suddenly defending bad writing is acceptable again. Sword Art Online fans constantly act like they're doing everyone a favor by telling people, stop defending the show. They pretend it's some noble lesson about accepting criticism and not being blindly attached to fiction. But the second someone criticizes Sword Art Online itself, all that fake wisdom disappears instantly. Suddenly they can't follow their own advice for even 5 seconds. They preach about how people should learn to accept flaws and stop making excuses for bad writing. Yet they spend all their time doing exactly that for Sword Art Online. Every criticism gets met with excuses, mental gymnastics, or condescending explanations about how critics didn't understand the story. So apparently defending anime is only bad when other fandoms do it. When Sword Art Online fans do it, it magically becomes reasonable and justified. That's what makes the whole thing so obnoxious. They act morally superior, like they're the mature ones in the discussion, while completely failing to practice what they preach. If they genuinely believed defending flawed shows was a problem, they'd apply that standard to Sword Art Online too. Instead, they just weaponize that argument against other people while giving themselves a free pass. At that point, it's not about consistency or honesty anymore. It's just hypocrisy mixed with fandom bias. If Sword Art Online fans really wanted to ignore the hate, then they wouldn't constantly be defending the show in the first place. You cannot claim you're above the criticism while actively hunting down criticism to argue with. That's not ignoring hate, that's obsessing over it. The moment someone starts writing paragraphs defending Sword Art Online against every negative opinion online, they've already proven the hate got to them. Ignoring criticism would mean moving on, enjoying the show privately, and not caring what random people think. Instead, a lot of Sword Art Online fans do the complete opposite. They search for negative comments, jump into arguments, quote tweet criticism, make rant videos, and spend hours trying to debunk opinions they supposedly don't care about. It's completely contradictory. They'll say things like, just let people hate, or I don't care what critics think, but then immediately write a 5-page essay explaining why every criticism is wrong. If you truly didn't care, you wouldn't feel the need to defend the show every single time someone insults it. Constantly responding to hate proves the hate is bothering you. What's funny is that many of them act like they're taking the high road while doing this. They frame their defensive behavior as correcting misinformation or protecting the series from unfair criticism. But in reality, they're just emotionally reacting to opinions they can't handle seeing. They want to look calm and rational while clearly being deeply invested in winning arguments online. Defending Sword Art Online nonstop is literally the opposite of ignoring hate. Ignoring hate means not engaging with it. It means not chasing it down, not replying to it, and not letting it control your behavior. The second you go out of your way to argue with critics, you've already admitted the criticism matters to you. All Sword Art Online fans have to do is literally nothing. That's it. Nobody is forcing them into these arguments. Nobody is demanding they defend the show all the time. If they truly believed criticism doesn't matter, they could just ignore it and move on with their day. But apparently even doing absolutely nothing is too difficult for them. They always have to respond. They always have to jump in and defend Sword Art Online the second somebody insults it. Every negative opinion turns into an emergency situation where they suddenly feel obligated to correct people and explain why the critics are wrong. It's like they physically cannot let criticism exist without trying to fight it. And honestly, that level of defensiveness says a lot. Normal people don't treat entertainment like a personal attack on their identity. But with some Sword Art Online fans, the show clearly means way more to them than they want to admit. Their entire personality revolves around protecting this series from criticism, so every insult toward Sword Art Online feels like an insult toward them personally. That's why they react so aggressively and emotionally over a cartoon. What makes it even more pathetic is how predictable it is. They'll claim they're tired of the hate, but then actively keep the arguments alive themselves by constantly engaging with every critic they can find. They create the exact drama they complain about because they cannot resist defending the show. At that point, they're not victims of discourse, they're addicted to it. If your favorite anime is supposedly so good, you shouldn't need to spend your entire life acting as its unpaid defense force online. The fact that so many Sword Art Online fans feel compelled to do exactly that just makes them look insecure about the show they're desperately trying to protect. Sword Art Online fans constantly act like they're victims, like they're some oppressed minority bravely surviving persecution just because people criticize their favorite anime online. They talk about Sword Art Online hate as if they're enduring some massive injustice, instead of dealing with normal internet opinions about a popular show. It's ridiculously overdramatic. They act like every criticism is a personal attack, every joke is toxic, and every negative opinion is part of some coordinated campaign against them. Meanwhile, they willingly throw themselves into arguments all day long and then pretend they're being targeted when people push back. Nobody is forcing them into these discussions. They choose to involve themselves, escalate everything, and then cry about how unfair the fandom environment is afterward. What's especially annoying is how they try to frame themselves as the reasonable side while acting incredibly defensive and hostile toward critics. They'll accuse people of being obsessed haters, but then spend hours stalking comment sections, searching for negative takes, and arguing with strangers over an anime that ended years ago. The victim complex is unbelievable. They behave less like people enjoying a show and more like activists fighting for a cause. And the irony is that Sword Art Online is one of the most commercially successful anime franchises ever. It's not some underground series getting unfairly bullied by the mainstream. It made huge amounts of money, got multiple seasons, movies, games, merchandise, and an enormous fanbase worldwide. Yet some fans still talk like they're defending a persecuted masterpiece that society cruelly rejected. The persecution narrative completely falls apart the moment you look at how massively successful the franchise actually is. At a certain point, the victim mentality just becomes an excuse. It lets them dismiss criticism as hate instead of engaging honestly with why so many people dislike parts of the show. It's easier for them to pretend they're oppressed than admit the anime genuinely has flaws people don't enjoy. Sword Art Online fans seriously need to grow up and accept that people are allowed to have different opinions. Just because someone doesn't like the show doesn't mean they're a hater, jealous, ignorant, or secretly obsessed with Sword Art Online. Sometimes people simply think the anime is bad. It's not some unimaginable concept, no matter how hard certain fans try to treat it like one. A lot of Sword Art Online fans act like criticism is inherently illegitimate unless it's wrapped in 10 layers of politeness and praise first. The second somebody bluntly says they dislike the writing, the characters, or Kirito, the fan base instantly gets defensive and starts interrogating them like they committed a crime. Instead of accepting that taste is subjective, they act like every negative opinion needs to be corrected, debated, or debunked. That mindset is unbelievably immature. Mature people understand that not everyone is going to love the same media they do. They don't melt down every time someone insults their favorite series. They don't spend hours trying to force strangers online to change their minds. They accept disagreement and move on. Sword Art Online fans, meanwhile, often act like criticism of the show threatens their entire identity. What makes it worse is how selective they are about this supposed respect for opinions. They constantly demand that people respect others' tastes. But the moment someone says they dislike Sword Art Online, that respect disappears instantly. Suddenly the critic didn't understand the story, only watched clips, or is jumping on the hate bandwagon. So apparently different opinions are only valid when they're positive. At the end of the day, nobody owes Sword Art Online praise. People are free to love it, hate it, mock it, or not care about it at all. That's how opinions work. The internet does not exist to constantly reassure Sword Art Online fans that their favorite anime is untouchable. The sooner they learn to handle criticism without taking it personally, the less embarrassing the fandom will look. Sword Art Online has one of the most entitled fan bases imaginable. A lot of them genuinely act like people are obligated to love this show, and if you don't, then there must be something wrong with you personally. They cannot comprehend the idea that someone might watch Sword Art Online and simply think it's bad, poorly written, or overrated. To them, disliking the series is treated like some kind of personal failure in taste. They hype the show up like it's the greatest story ever told in the history of fiction, as if Sword Art Online is some untouchable literary masterpiece that transcends anime itself. The way some fans talk about it, you'd think it was on the level of classic novels or legendary cinema instead of an anime filled with inconsistent writing, shallow arcs, rushed relationships, and endless overpowered Kirito moments. The gap between their praise and the actual quality of the series is honestly absurd. What makes the fanbase so entitled is how offended they get when people don't share that exaggerated view of the show. They don't just disagree with criticism, they act insulted by its existence. If someone says Sword Art Online is overrated, fans immediately jump into defense mode trying to educate them about why the anime is secretly genius. They treat criticism like misinformation that needs correcting instead of accepting that people have different standards for storytelling. There's also this constant expectation that everyone should automatically respect Sword Art Online because it was influential or popular. But popularity does not make a series immune to criticism, and influence does not magically erase flaws. Plenty of people recognize Sword Art Online's impact on anime while still thinking the execution was weak. Sword Art Online fans often refuse to separate those two things because they're so emotionally attached to the series that they interpret any criticism as disrespect. At the end of the day, no show is entitled to universal praise, especially not Sword Art Online. People are allowed to think it's average. People are allowed to think it's bad. People are even allowed to think it's one of the most overrated anime ever made. The fanbase's inability to handle that reality without becoming defensive and condescending is exactly why so many people find them exhausting. The most ironic part is that Sword Art Online fans defending the show nonstop actually does more harm than good. Every angry reply, every defensive essay, every desperate attempt to debunk criticism just proves that the hate is getting under their skin. They think they're protecting the series, but all they're really doing is showing everyone how deeply bothered they are by negative opinions. If the criticism truly meant nothing to them, they wouldn't feel this constant need to respond. People who are genuinely unbothered don't spend hours arguing with strangers online over anime discourse. They don't search for criticism just to fight with it. They don't treat every negative comment like a personal attack that has to be countered immediately. The nonstop defensiveness completely destroys their claim that they don't care about the haters. In fact, the more aggressively they defend Sword Art Online, the more they unintentionally validate the criticism culture surrounding it. They give critics exactly the reaction they want. Every meltdown, every defensive rant, every smug, "you just didn't understand it" response tells people one thing very clearly. The criticism hit a nerve. And once people realize that, it only encourages more mockery because the fandom has made itself look emotionally fragile and incapable of handling disagreement. What's funny is that some Sword Art Online fans genuinely believe they're winning arguments by constantly defending the show, when in reality they're just keeping the negativity alive. Most criticism would fade away naturally if they ignored it, but instead they revive the discourse over and over. Because they cannot resist engaging with it. They turn every random opinion into a massive debate and then complain that the anime never escapes the hate. They are literally feeding the cycle themselves. The entire situation exposes how insecure a lot of the fanbase really is. Deep down, they know Sword Art Online is controversial and heavily criticized, and that clearly bothers them far more than they want to admit. So they overcompensate by trying to defend every flaw, shut down every critic, and convince everyone the series is misunderstood genius. But the harder they try, the more obvious it becomes that the criticism affects them emotionally. If they were truly confident in the show, they wouldn't need to act like its full-time bodyguards online. They'd just enjoy it and move on. The endless defending only proves the opposite. The hate works, it bothers them, and they cannot stand seeing people disrespect the thing they built their identity around. And Sword Art Online fans know this. Deep down, they know defending the show online is not going to magically erase criticism or make everyone suddenly love Sword Art Online. They know arguing with strangers on the internet is pointless. They know people have already made up their minds about the series. And yet they still cannot stop themselves from defending it every single time somebody says something negative. That's what makes the behavior so embarrassing. You can't even excuse it as ignorance anymore because they clearly understand how useless it is. They know they're not solving anything. They know they're not ending the hate. They know critics are still going to criticize the show no matter how many essays they write explaining why Kirito is actually well written, or why some terrible arc is misunderstood. None of it changes anything. But despite knowing all of that, they still compulsively respond anyway because they emotionally need to. It's not about logic or discussion at that point. It's pure attachment and insecurity. They see criticism of Sword Art Online and immediately feel this urge to defend it because they've tied so much of their identity and pride to the series that they physically cannot let negative opinions slide. And honestly, that's the most telling part. If somebody truly believed criticism didn't matter, they would stop engaging with it after realizing how pointless the arguments are. A normal person eventually says, "Whatever, like what you like," and moves on. Sword Art Online fans often do the exact opposite. They keep repeating the same arguments for years, fully aware that nobody's mind is changing, because the act of defending the show matters more to them emotionally than the actual outcome. At that point, it stops looking like passion and starts looking like obsession. They're trapped in this endless cycle where criticism bothers them. They rush to defend the anime, the defense changes nothing, and then they repeat the process again the next time someone insults Sword Art Online. They know it's pointless, they know it doesn't help, and they still keep doing it anyway. That's why you can't even call it ignorance anymore. It's self-inflicted frustration. Even in the comment sections of my videos, there are always tons of Sword Art Online fans desperately defending the show and trying to debunk everything I say. They write these massive paragraphs explaining why my criticism is supposedly wrong, misunderstood, unfair, or taken out of context. But hold on a second. I thought they were ignoring the hate. Because if you were truly ignoring the hate, you wouldn't even be watching my videos in the first place. You definitely wouldn't be sitting there listening to criticism of Sword Art Online for 10 or 20 minutes straight, scrolling through the comments afterward, and then typing out entire essays trying to argue with me. That is literally the opposite of ignoring hate. That's actively seeking it out and obsessively engaging with it. What makes it so funny is how they unintentionally expose themselves every single time they comment. They claim critics are obsessed with Sword Art Online, yet they're the ones voluntarily consuming anti-Sword Art Online content just so they can defend the anime in the comments section. Nobody forced them to click the video. Nobody forced them to stay. Nobody forced them to write a 5-paragraph response. They chose to do all of that because the criticism bothered them enough that they felt compelled to react. And the longer the comments are, the worse it looks. Someone who genuinely doesn't care does not spend half their day crafting detailed rebuttals to random YouTube criticism. A person who is actually unbothered would click off the video and move on with their life. The fact that so many Sword Art Online fans can't do that says everything. They'll keep insisting they don't care about the hate, while simultaneously proving the exact opposite through their actions. Watching anti-Sword Art Online videos, arguing in the comments, trying to debunk criticism, and constantly defending the show are all admissions that the hate affects them emotionally. Their behavior completely contradicts their words. At some point, they need to stop pretending they're detached from the discourse. If they were really ignoring the hate, they wouldn't even be in the room. And the irony gets even worse when you realize I don't even get that many comments in the first place. The scale of it isn't even close to what people like to pretend it is. Yet even in a relatively small comment section, you still see Sword Art Online fans showing up to defend the show like it's a full-time job. Now imagine what happens under the more popular Sword Art Online critique videos on YouTube. The bigger creators, the ones who actually get traction and reach a wider audience, end up with comment sections flooded by defensive fans trying to correct every point, argue every opinion, and set the record straight about the series. It becomes predictable at that point. Criticism goes up, and so does the intensity of the defense, which only reinforces the original point. If the goal was really to ignore the hate, none of this should be happening. The size of the channel or video doesn't change the logic. If Sword Art Online fans were genuinely unaffected, they would simply not engage at all, regardless of whether the video has 50 views or 500,000. The fact that engagement scales up with visibility just shows how reactive the response is. And it also exposes something else. They're not just randomly stumbling into these discussions. They're actively present in spaces where Sword Art Online is criticized, monitoring reactions, and jumping in to respond whenever they feel the need. That's not avoidance. That's participation. So instead of ignoring the hate, what you actually see is a pattern where criticism gets more attention, not less, as the audience grows. And the more attention it gets, the more defensive responses appear. That doesn't look like detachment. It looks like a community that is consistently drawn into arguments it claims to want no part of. The real villains in this situation aren't the haters at all, they're the fans themselves. The criticism would mostly just exist and fade into the background like it does for every other popular anime if it weren't constantly being dragged back into circulation by defensive overreactions. In a lot of cases, the fandom is the one keeping the argument alive. Instead of letting negative opinions pass, some Sword Art Online fans repeatedly engage with them, escalate them, and turn small criticisms into drawn-out internet debates. Every time they rush in to argue, correct, or debunk a take, they reinforce the visibility of the very thing they claim to be tired of. It stops being about defending the show and starts becoming a cycle of reaction that keeps the discourse going indefinitely. From the outside, it often looks less like fans protecting a series and more like fans feeding the controversy around it. The more aggressively they respond, the more attention the criticism gets, and the more it spreads. In that sense, the dynamic becomes self-inflicted. Without constant responses, most of these arguments would burn out quickly, but the ongoing engagement keeps restarting them. That's why it ends up feeling like the fans are making things worse on their own. Not because criticism wouldn't exist otherwise, but because the intensity and persistence of the defense amplifies it. The haters don't need to do much when every negative opinion is met with long, emotional rebuttals that keep the topic circulating. So the real driver of the cycle isn't just the criticism itself, but the reaction to it. And in that feedback loop, the fandom ends up playing a bigger role in sustaining the conflict than the people originally making the complaints. It makes sense that a terrible anime would attract a terrible fan base. If a show is widely criticized for weak writing, inconsistent character work, and overhyped execution, it shouldn't be surprising that the surrounding discourse gets messy too. People don't just argue about the show itself, they start projecting, defending, attacking, and turning it into a personality test. At that point, the quality of the conversation around it often reflects the quality of the discourse the show already generates. When a series is heavily polarizing, It tends to attract the most defensive voices on one side and the most aggressive critics on the other. The middle ground disappears, and what's left is constant escalation. So instead of calm discussion about flaws and strengths, you get entrenched camps treating opinions like battles to win rather than perspectives to consider. In that environment, the fan base can start to look just as chaotic as the criticism it reacts to. Not because every fan is like that, but because the loudest voices define the perception. People who constantly overdefend the show, refuse any criticism, or treat disagreement as hostility end up shaping how the fandom is seen from the outside. So it's less about some inherent nature of fans and more about how sustained controversy affects behavior. A controversial show doesn't just get criticized, it also produces an audience that is constantly put in a defensive posture. Over time, that can distort the entire discussion around it into something far more combative than it needs to be. Watching all of this unfold honestly makes me glad that I'm not a Sword Art Online fan. I never was a fan, and at this point I can't imagine ever becoming one. Not even because of the show itself, although I've made my opinions on that pretty clear. It's the culture surrounding the fandom that I find exhausting. I want no part of this endless cycle where people spend years insisting that the critics don't matter while simultaneously obsessing over every negative opinion they can find. I don't want to spend my free time arguing with decade-old criticism videos. I don't want to spend hours explaining why strangers on the internet are wrong for disliking a cartoon. And I definitely don't want to be part of a community that constantly declares victory while acting like it's still under siege. What makes it even stranger is that being a fan of something should be fun. That's the whole point. If you genuinely love a series, you'd think most of the conversation would revolve around what makes it enjoyable. The characters, the story, the themes, the moments that resonated with you. Instead, so much of the Sword Art Online discourse seems focused on fighting critics, correcting critics, responding to critics, and complaining about critics. At some point, it starts to feel less like a fandom and more like a public relations department. And that's what I find so bizarre about the whole thing. Sword Art Online fans constantly tell everyone how much they love the series. Yet so much of their energy seems devoted to people who don't. If the show is really that amazing, why not just enjoy it? Why spend years trying to convince people who already made up their minds? Why turn every discussion into another chapter of a debate that supposedly ended long ago? The entire thing looks exhausting from the outside. It's like being trapped in an endless loop where the same arguments are repeated over and over again, except nobody is actually changing their minds. The critics still criticize. The defenders still defend. Both sides know exactly what the other side is going to say before the conversation even starts. So yes, I'm perfectly happy being on the outside looking in. I have no interest in joining a fandom that seems permanently locked in a battle with people it claims don't matter. If that's what being a Sword Art Online fan looks like, then I'll pass. At this point, I honestly have to wonder how some Sword Art Online fans sleep at night. The level of contradiction on display is so blatant that you'd think it would cause at least a little bit of self-reflection. Apparently not. What amazes me is how effortlessly they jump between completely incompatible positions. One minute they'll tell you that nobody hates Sword Art Online anymore, that the critics lost, and that the anime has been fully vindicated by history. The next minute they'll spend an hour complaining about all the people who supposedly hate Sword Art Online. They don't seem to notice that these two arguments directly undermine each other. The most impressive part is the confidence. Most people would hesitate before making claims that contradict something they said 5 minutes earlier. Sword Art Online fans, however, seem completely unfazed by it. They'll insist that criticism is irrelevant and then write a 10-page response to that same criticism. They'll claim that defending the show is pointless and then spend their entire afternoon defending the show. They'll say the haters don't matter and then make the haters the center of every discussion. It's almost fascinating to watch. The contradictions aren't hidden. They're not subtle. They're sitting right there in plain sight. You don't need to analyze subtext or read between the lines. The inconsistency is usually visible on the same page, in the same conversation, sometimes even in the same paragraph. And yet the cycle never ends. The fandom keeps repeating the same talking points, keeps making the same arguments, and keeps running into the same contradictions. Nobody seems willing to stop and ask whether the narrative actually makes sense. Instead, the goal appears to be saying whatever is necessary to defend the show in that particular moment, even if it completely conflicts with what was said earlier. From the outside, it's genuinely baffling. If you're going to defend something, at least make the defense internally consistent. Don't tell me the hate is gone while simultaneously complaining about the hate. Don't tell me critics don't matter while dedicating half your online activity to arguing with critics. And don't tell me the debate is over while acting like you're still fighting it every single day. The sheer lack of self-awareness is what makes the whole thing so entertaining. At some point, the contradictions become more interesting than the show itself. Sword Art Online fans really need to get off their high horse and stop playing the victim card. One of the strangest aspects of the fandom is how often it tries to present itself as some persecuted minority despite supporting one of the most commercially successful anime franchises of the last decade. Think about it for a second. This isn't some obscure series that nobody has heard of. This isn't a forgotten cult classic with a tiny fanbase struggling to survive. Sword Art Online is one of the biggest anime franchises in the industry. It has sold millions of novels, spawned multiple anime seasons, movies, games, merchandise, and maintained a huge audience for years. By almost any objective measure, the franchise has been an enormous success. Yet some fans talk as if they're bravely defending an underdog that the entire world is unfairly attacking. Every criticism becomes evidence of a hate campaign. Every negative opinion becomes proof that critics are biased. Every joke about the series gets treated like a personal attack against the fandom. The level of sensitivity can be difficult to understand. The reality is that criticism comes with popularity. Every major franchise gets criticized. Fans of anime like Naruto, Bleach, Dragon Ball, Attack on Titan, and countless others have heard negative opinions about their favorite series for years. That's what happens when something becomes popular enough to enter mainstream discussion. Not everyone is going to like it. What makes the Sword Art Online fandom stand out is the tendency to interpret ordinary criticism as some kind of ongoing injustice. Instead of accepting that people have different tastes, some fans seem determined to frame every disagreement as evidence that Sword Art Online has been uniquely mistreated. It's a narrative that becomes harder and harder to take seriously when the franchise continues to enjoy massive success and widespread recognition. That's why the victim mentality feels so out of place. If the series is as beloved as fans claim, if the critics lost, if the hate train died years ago, and if millions of people enjoy the franchise, then why keep acting like you're under attack? At some point, you have to choose between celebrating victory and claiming persecution. Trying to do both at the same time just makes the contradiction impossible to ignore. The truth is that disliking Sword Art Online is not an act of oppression. Criticizing a popular anime is not harassment. And seeing negative opinions online is not evidence of some grand conspiracy against the franchise. It's simply the reality of being a fan of a highly visible piece of media. The sooner some fans accept that, the healthier the discussion around the series will become. Until then, the fandom is going to keep finding itself trapped in the same cycle, insisting that everyone loves Sword Art Online while simultaneously acting like it's the most unfairly treated anime ever created. And the longer that contradiction continues, the harder it becomes to take those complaints seriously. From my perspective, it's genuinely baffling why anyone would willingly join a community like this. When I look at the Sword Art Online fandom, I don't see a group of people confidently enjoying a series they love. I see a community that seems trapped in an endless feedback loop, constantly repeating the same arguments, the same defenses, and the same complaints about critics. What makes it so strange is how little room there seems to be for self-reflection. Certain talking points get repeated so often that they start to feel more like slogans than actual arguments. The critics are wrong. The haters are jealous. The hate train is dead. Sword Art Online was always a masterpiece. After hearing the same claims over and over again, you start to wonder whether people are actually thinking about these positions or simply repeating what they've heard from other fans. That's why, from the outside, the fandom can sometimes come across as incredibly insular. Instead of questioning the assumptions that circulate within the community, many fans seem more interested in reinforcing them. The result is a culture where everyone reassures each other that the critics are irrelevant while somehow remaining completely obsessed with those same critics. And that's the part one find difficult to understand. If a community is genuinely confident in its views, it shouldn't need constant validation. It shouldn't need to endlessly reassure itself that it was right all along. People who are secure in their opinions generally don't spend years trying to prove those opinions to strangers on the internet. The entire thing often feels less like independent thinking and more like groupthink. Once certain narratives become popular within the fandom, they get repeated so frequently that challenging them almost seems unthinkable. The conversation becomes predictable. You already know what arguments are coming before they're even made. Maybe that's why I find the community so unappealing. I don't want to be part of a fandom where everyone appears to be reading from the same script. I don't want to spend my time repeating the same talking points, fighting the same battles, and complaining about the same critics year after year. That sounds exhausting. If being part of the community means constantly defending the show, constantly talking about the haters, and constantly recycling the same arguments, then I have no interest in joining. From where I'm standing, the fandom looks far more frustrating than the anime itself. It genuinely makes me wonder whether some Sword Art Online fans are aware that other anime communities exist. The way they talk about criticism, you'd think Sword Art Online is the first show in history to ever receive negative feedback. Every complaint gets treated like some major event. Every critical video gets discussed to death. Every negative opinion is analyzed as if it's part of some ongoing crisis that the fandom needs to address. The strange thing is that every major anime fandom deals with criticism. Fans of popular series have been hearing negative opinions for decades. Whether it's Naruto, Bleach, Dragon Ball, Attack on Titan, Demon Slayer, or practically any other successful anime, there are always critics. There are always people who think the writing is bad, the characters are overrated, or the story isn't as good as fans claim. That's simply what happens when a series becomes popular enough to reach a large audience. Yet some Sword Art Online fans behave as though criticism itself is abnormal. Instead of accepting that not everyone is going to enjoy the same show, they seem completely fixated on proving that every negative opinion is somehow illegitimate. It's not enough for them to simply disagree with critics. They often feel the need to explain why the critics are wrong, why the criticism is unfair, why the criticism is outdated, or why the critics secretly don't understand the series. The entire mindset feels incredibly isolated from how most fandoms operate. Most communities eventually move on. They talk about new episodes, new characters, upcoming projects, or whatever else interests them. They don't spend years obsessing over people who dislike the thing they like. At some point, they accept that criticism exists and continue enjoying the series anyway. That's what makes the Sword Art Online fandom so bizarre from the outside. So much of the conversation seems trapped in the past. The fandom is still arguing with critics, still talking about haters, still trying to relitigate debates that should have ended years ago. It's as if the community never got the memo that it's okay for people to dislike a popular show. Sometimes it feels like portions of the fandom have built their entire identity around responding to criticism. Instead of discussing what makes Sword Art Online enjoyable, they're constantly focused on defending it. Instead of celebrating the franchise's success, they're busy complaining about people who don't share their enthusiasm. The result is a community that often appears more interested in fighting critics than appreciating the series itself. And that's the part one find hardest to understand. If Sword Art Online is truly as beloved as fans claim, if the critics are supposedly irrelevant, and if the hate train supposedly died years ago, then why is so much of the discussion still centered around proving those things? A confident fan base shouldn't need constant reassurance. A secure community shouldn't feel compelled to defend itself every time someone says they didn't like an anime. From the outside, it looks less like a fandom enjoying a show and more like a fandom desperately trying to convince itself that everyone else should enjoy it too. Of course, the fans will never grow or engage in any meaningful self-reflection if every problem is automatically blamed on someone else. That's probably the most frustrating part of the entire situation. The moment criticism appears, the conversation immediately shifts away from whether the criticism has any merit and toward attacking the people making it. If someone points out flaws in the writing, it's because they're biased. If someone dislikes the characters, it's because they misunderstood the story. If someone thinks the series is overrated, it's because they jumped on a hate train. No matter what the criticism is, there always seems to be a convenient explanation that allows the fandom to dismiss it without actually engaging with it. What rarely happens is the simplest response of all. Maybe some people just have legitimate reasons for not liking the show. Maybe they watched it, understood it perfectly well, and still came away unimpressed. Maybe they saw the same scenes, the same characters, and the same story as everyone else but reached a different conclusion. That's not some unimaginable possibility. That's how opinions work. The problem is that self-reflection requires a willingness to entertain the possibility that critics might occasionally have a point. It requires acknowledging that a popular series can have flaws. It requires recognizing that commercial success doesn't automatically invalidate criticism. But if you've spent years convincing yourself that every critic is either dishonest, ignorant, or motivated by hatred, then self-reflection becomes almost impossible. Instead, everything becomes somebody else's fault. The critics are the problem. The YouTubers are the problem. The anime community is the problem. The algorithms are the problem. The haters are the problem. Everyone else is responsible except the fandom itself. It's a mindset that protects people from uncomfortable questions, but it also prevents any meaningful growth. What's ironic is that the fandom often complains about being misunderstood while showing very little interest in understanding opposing viewpoints. They want critics to listen to them, but they rarely extend the same courtesy in return. The expectation seems to be that everyone else should reconsider their opinions while the fandom's own assumptions remain completely untouched. That's why the same arguments keep repeating year after year. Nothing changes because nobody is willing to examine the underlying assumptions. If every criticism is automatically dismissed and every disagreement is treated as evidence of bias, then there is no opportunity for reflection. The conclusion is predetermined before the discussion even begins. In the end, a community that believes every problem is someone else's fault will remain stuck exactly where it is. Growth requires self-awareness. Improvement requires introspection. And if every negative reaction is blamed on critics, haters, or outsiders, then the fandom will continue repeating the same cycle indefinitely while wondering why the conversation never moves forward. One of the biggest reasons I could never see myself becoming part of the Sword Art Online fandom is how unwelcoming the community often appears from the outside. When I look at a fandom, I want to see people sharing their enthusiasm, discussing their favorite moments, recommending the series to newcomers, and generally creating an environment that makes people want to participate. That's usually how healthy communities grow. What I see in portions of the Sword Art Online fandom is the exact opposite. So much of the conversation revolves around defending the show, arguing with critics, and complaining about negative opinions. Instead of feeling like a community that's excited to talk about an anime it loves, it often feels like a community that's permanently stuck in a defensive posture. As a newcomer looking in, that's not exactly an inviting atmosphere. The problem is that when a fandom becomes obsessed with defending itself, it starts treating disagreement as a threat. People who have criticisms aren't viewed as people with different opinions. They're viewed as enemies, haters, or bad faith actors. The result is an environment where conversations can quickly become hostile, especially if someone isn't already fully on board with the community's views. That's what makes the fandom so unattractive to me. If I were considering whether to join a community, I'd want to know that I could express my honest opinions without immediately being accused of misunderstanding the series or hopping on a hate train. I'd want discussions, not loyalty tests. I'd want people who are comfortable acknowledging flaws, not people who treat every criticism like an attack that needs to be repelled. Honestly, there are plenty of fandoms that have reputations for being argumentative, obsessive, or overly passionate. The K-pop community gets mocked constantly. The Star Wars fandom is practically famous for internal drama and endless debates. Yet even then, I'd probably rather spend time in those communities because at least everyone openly acknowledges that they're chaotic. There's a certain honesty to it. With parts of the Sword Art Online fandom, the contradiction is what makes it exhausting. The community constantly claims the debate is over while continuing to argue. It claims the critics don't matter while remaining fixated on them. It claims the hate is gone while endlessly discussing it. The entire atmosphere feels trapped in a cycle that never ends. As an outsider, that's not something that makes me want to join. If anything, it pushes me further away. A fandom should make people excited to engage with a series. It should make people curious to learn more. When the dominant impression is endless defensiveness and constant arguments about critics, the community stops looking welcoming and starts looking exhausting. And if those are the options on the table, I'd rather take my chances somewhere else. You could not pay me to join the Sword Art Online community. Seriously, no amount of money would make it worth it. If someone offered me a check and told me that my job was to spend every day arguing alongside Sword Art Online fans on the internet, I'd decline without a second thought. In fact, it's the exact opposite. If anything, I'd be willing to pay money to avoid having those conversations. At least then I'd be getting something valuable in return. Peace and quiet. That sounds like a much better deal than spending hours trapped in endless debates about why the critics are wrong, why the hate train is still relevant, and why Sword Art Online is secretly a misunderstood masterpiece. What makes the fandom so exhausting isn't even the fact that people like the show. People are allowed to enjoy whatever they want. The problem is the culture that often develops around defending it. Every discussion eventually seems to lead back to the same arguments. The same talking points get repeated. The same complaints get recycled. The same debates get resurrected year after year, as if nobody has learned anything from the previous 1,000 times they happened. Imagine willingly signing up for that experience. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that you're about to spend your day arguing about criticism from 10 years ago. Imagine constantly discussing haters who supposedly don't matter. Imagine repeatedly insisting that the debate is over while continuing to participate in it. At some point, it starts to sound less like a hobby and more like a punishment. The strangest part is that many fans seem completely unaware of how exhausting the whole thing looks from the outside. They act as though they're participating in some important mission to defend the reputation of an anime. Meanwhile, everyone else is wondering why they're still having the exact same arguments they've been having for over a decade. Life is too short for that. There are thousands of anime communities, gaming communities, movie communities, and hobby communities filled with people who actually seem excited to discuss the things they enjoy. There are communities built around sharing recommendations, discovering new series, and celebrating what makes their favorite stories special. Then there's the section of the Sword Art Online fandom that appears permanently trapped in an endless argument with critics. Given those choices, I know which one I'm picking. The idea of voluntarily joining a community that spends so much time defending itself sounds miserable. I'd rather spend that energy literally anywhere else. There are more productive ways to spend an afternoon than arguing with strangers about weather. A decade-old criticism of Sword Art Online was fair. So no, you couldn't pay me to join that community. The sales pitch simply isn't very convincing. When a fandom's defining characteristic appears to be endless defensiveness and perpetual victimhood, the only reasonable response is to keep walking. The most hilarious part of all of this is what happens whenever I actually make a video about Sword Art Online. If you look at the engagement, my videos usually end up getting far more dislikes than likes. In other words, a huge portion of the audience watching those videos appears to be made up of Sword Art Online fans. And when you think about it, that's incredibly ironic. According to many fans, the critics don't matter. The hate train is dead. Nobody takes Sword Art Online criticism seriously anymore. The people who dislike the show are supposedly a tiny minority that has been left behind by the rest of the anime community. Okay, then why are so many Sword Art Online fans watching criticism videos? If the critics are irrelevant, why give them attention? If the arguments are outdated, why click on the video? If the opinions don't matter, why spend 30 minutes listening to them? The behavior doesn't match the rhetoric. What makes it even funnier is that some of these viewers seem to be actively searching for criticism. Nobody accidentally finds 10 different anti-Sword Art Online videos in a row. At some point, you're choosing to engage with content that you already know you're going to disagree with. You're voluntarily walking into a conversation that you claim isn't worth having. That's what makes the dislike ratio so interesting. It's not just evidence that people disagree with me. Of course they disagree with me. That's expected. The interesting part is that they're still there watching. Think about that for a second. If I truly believed a critic had nothing worthwhile to say about a series I loved, I wouldn't spend hours consuming their content. I certainly wouldn't make a habit of monitoring every opinion they posted. I'd simply move on with my life and enjoy the thing I like. Yet that's not what seems to happen here. Instead, there appears to be a segment of the fandom that is deeply invested in criticism while simultaneously insisting that criticism doesn't matter. They watch the videos. They leave comments. They argue in the replies. They hit the dislike button. Then they go back to telling everyone that the critics are irrelevant. The contradiction is almost perfect. In a strange way, the dislike ratio often reinforces the exact point I'm making. If so many viewers are dedicated fans who feel compelled to respond to criticism, then clearly the criticism still has an audience. Clearly the debate isn't as dead as people claim. And clearly there are fans who care a great deal about what critics have to say, regardless of how often they insist otherwise. That's why I find the whole thing so amusing. The people who most passionately argue that criticism is irrelevant often end up becoming the most engaged consumers of criticism. They can't stop talking about the critics. They can't stop responding to the critics. And they can't stop watching the critics. For a group of people who insist the conversation is over, they seem remarkably committed to keeping it alive. One of the biggest ironies surrounding the Sword Art Online fandom is that some of the very people who claim to hate negativity are actively helping to keep it alive. They spend so much time talking about the hate, responding to the hate, complaining about the hate, and searching for examples of the hate that they end up giving it far more attention than it would have received otherwise. Think about how often the topic comes up. In many discussions, criticism of Sword Art Online isn't just mentioned once and forgotten. It becomes the center of the conversation. Fans bring up old reviews, old videos, old forum posts, and old arguments that most people would have forgotten years ago. Instead of allowing those discussions to fade away naturally, they keep resurrecting them and putting them back into circulation. That's what makes the situation so ironic. Many fans seem genuinely convinced that they're fighting against negativity, yet their actions often have the opposite effect. Every time they bring up some ancient criticism to complain about it, they're introducing that criticism to a new audience. Every time they tell everyone how unfair a particular review was, they're encouraging people to go look at that review. Every time they spend hours discussing the haters, they're making the haters the center of attention again. In a way, they're doing the critics' work for them. If the goal is to move beyond the criticism, constantly talking about the criticism is probably the worst possible strategy. Most controversies eventually disappear because people stop discussing them. Interest fades. New topics emerge. People move on. But when a fandom continuously revisits the same arguments year after year, it prevents that process from happening. What's even stranger is that many fans don't seem to recognize their role in keeping the conversation alive. They view themselves as victims of an ongoing problem without considering how much they contribute to that problem's visibility. The criticism doesn't remain relevant entirely on its own. It remains relevant because people continue discussing it, responding to it, and treating it as something that demands constant attention. This creates a cycle that feeds itself. Fans see criticism and respond to it. The response generates more discussion. The discussion makes the criticism more visible. The increased visibility leads to more responses. Then the fandom points to the resulting discussion as proof that the hate is everywhere. Meanwhile, they rarely stop to consider how much of that visibility is being generated by the fandom itself. That's why the situation feels so self-defeating. If the objective is to prove that Sword Art Online has moved beyond its old controversies, constantly dragging those controversies back into the spotlight accomplishes the exact opposite. Instead of helping the fandom move forward, it keeps everyone focused on the same old arguments. The most frustrating part is that many fans seem completely unaware of this dynamic. They sincerely believe they're defending the series and protecting its reputation. But from the outside, it often looks like they're unintentionally preserving the very thing they claim to despise. The more they obsess over the hate, the more visible the hate becomes. The more they complain about critics, the more attention those critics receive. In other words, the fandom's endless battle against criticism often ends up ensuring that the criticism never truly goes away. And the most ironic part of all is that many of the people participating in that cycle don't seem to realize they're helping create the problem they're complaining about. By constantly talking about the hate and complaining about it, Sword Art Online fans are doing the exact opposite of what they claim they want. If their goal is to move past the criticism and prove that the old debates no longer matter, then endlessly bringing those debates back into the spotlight is a very strange way of accomplishing that. The reality is that most internet controversies die for a simple reason. People stop talking about them. Discussions lose momentum. New topics replace old ones. Communities move on to other things. That's how online discourse usually works. What was once a major argument gradually fades into obscurity because nobody sees a reason to keep revisiting it. But that process can't happen if people refuse to let the subject die. Every time a fan makes another post about the Sword Art Online hate train, they're keeping the topic alive. Every time someone complains about critics from years ago, they're reminding everyone that those critics exist. Every time the fandom starts another discussion about how unfairly Sword Art Online has been treated, they're pushing the conversation back toward the very thing they claim to be tired of discussing. It's almost self-sabotage. Imagine if the fandom collectively stopped talking about the haters tomorrow. No more posts about criticism. No more complaints about negative reviews. No more endless debates about whether Sword Art Online is misunderstood. How long do you think those old controversies would remain relevant? Probably not very long. Most people would move on. Most people already have moved on. Yet portions of the fandom keep dragging the conversation back to the same place. They act as though they're responding to the hate, but in many cases they're actively sustaining interest in it. They're giving it attention. They're giving it visibility. They're making sure it remains part of the discussion. That's what makes the whole thing so ironic. Fans often talk as though the hate is some external force that refuses to go away on its own. But when you look at how much time is spent discussing it, a significant portion of its continued visibility comes from the fandom itself. They're constantly reminding everyone that the criticism exists. The situation becomes even stranger when you consider that many fans simultaneously claim the hate is dead. If the hate is truly dead, why keep resurrecting it? Why keep bringing it up? Why keep making it the focus of discussions? A dead topic doesn't need weekly updates reminding everyone that it's dead. The truth is that people who genuinely move on from criticism stop talking about it. They focus on the things they enjoy instead. They discuss new developments, favorite moments, and future projects. They don't spend years fighting the same battles against the same critics. That's why the constant complaints feel so counterproductive. The fandom says it wants the hate to disappear, yet it repeatedly gives that hate a platform by making it the center of attention. The fandom says it wants to move forward, yet it keeps looking backward. The fandom says the critics don't matter, yet it continues treating them as one of the most important topics of discussion. In many ways, the fandom has become one of the primary reasons these conversations continue. By constantly talking about the hate and complaining about it, they're keeping the hate alive, keeping it visible, and keeping it part of the public discussion long after it might have faded away on its own. At a certain point, Sword Art Online fans have nobody to blame but themselves. If the fandom is tired of discussing the hate, tired of discussing critics, and tired of reliving the same arguments year after year, then maybe they should stop making those topics the center of every conversation. That's what makes the situation so frustrating to watch from the outside. The fandom constantly complains about criticism, yet it also plays a major role in keeping that criticism relevant. It constantly complains about the haters, yet it seems unable to stop talking about them. It constantly claims the debate is over, yet it keeps participating in that debate. After a while, it becomes difficult to take the complaints seriously because the fandom's actions keep contradicting its words. The hypocrisy is impossible to ignore. Fans will insist that critics don't matter, then spend hours responding to critics. They'll claim the hate train died years ago, then produce endless discussions about the hate train. They'll tell other people to stop arguing about Sword Art Online, then immediately jump into another argument about Sword Art Online. The contradiction is so obvious that it almost becomes the defining characteristic of the community. What really stands out is how often the narrative changes depending on what's convenient. If Sword Art Online is successful, Fans point to its popularity as proof that the critics were wrong. If criticism appears, suddenly the fandom is being unfairly targeted. If people stop talking about criticism, fans declare victory. If criticism starts trending again, they act as though they're under attack. The standards seem to change from one conversation to the next. That's why so many of the complaints ring hollow. A community that genuinely believes criticism doesn't matter wouldn't be this obsessed with it. A community that genuinely believes the debate is over wouldn't keep trying to restart it. And a community that genuinely wants to move on wouldn't spend so much time revisiting the same grievances. In the end, the fandom's biggest problem isn't necessarily the critics. It's the inability of some fans to be consistent about what they actually believe. They want to claim victory while still acting persecuted. They want to dismiss criticism while still arguing about it. They want to say the hate is gone while continuing to complain about it. Those positions don't fit together, and the more often they're repeated, the more obvious the contradiction becomes. If some fans are frustrated by the reputation their community has developed, they should spend less time blaming critics and more time looking at the behavior that helped create that reputation in the first place. Because when the same contradictions keep appearing over and over again, eventually people stop focusing on the critics and start noticing the contradictions themselves. Sword Art Online fans need to stop blaming outsiders for the franchise's reputation and start looking at their own role in creating it. One of the most common narratives in the fandom is that critics, haters, YouTubers, and random people on the internet are responsible for all the negativity surrounding the series. According to this view, the reputation problem was imposed on Sword Art Online from the outside. But what if that's not the whole story? What if a significant portion of that reputation was reinforced by the fandom itself? When people think about the Sword Art Online community, they don't just think about the anime. They think about the endless arguments. They think about the constant discussions about haters. They think about the defensiveness, the victim mentality, and the obsession with proving critics wrong. Fair or not, those things have become part of the fandom's public image. And the strange thing is that this image wasn't created by outsiders alone. It was shaped by years of fan behavior. Every time someone insists that the hate is gone while simultaneously complaining about the hate, they're reinforcing the stereotype. Every time someone declares that critics don't matter before writing a 10-page response to those critics, they're reinforcing the stereotype. Every time someone turns a discussion about the anime into a discussion about haters, they're reinforcing the stereotype. Then the fandom turns around and wonders why people have a negative perception of it. The answer is sitting right in front of them. Reputations don't appear out of nowhere. Communities develop reputations based on how they present themselves. If a fandom spends years making criticism, haters, and old internet arguments the center of its identity, people are eventually going to associate the fandom with those things. That's why blaming outsiders only goes so far. Critics didn't force fans to obsess over criticism. Haters didn't force fans to spend years discussing haters. YouTubers didn't force fans to keep old arguments alive long after most people had moved on. Those were choices made within the community itself. The irony is that many fans seem determined to fight the reputation while continuing the behavior that created it. They want people to stop seeing the fandom as defensive, yet they respond to everything defensively. They want people to stop associating the fandom with endless arguments, yet they keep starting endless arguments. They want the discussion to move on, yet they keep dragging it back to the same topics. At some point, responsibility has to enter the conversation. Not every negative perception comes from some external hate campaign. Sometimes communities contribute to their own image through the way they behave. And until parts of the Sword Art Online fandom acknowledge that possibility, they're going to remain trapped in the same cycle of complaining about a reputation that they continue to reinforce themselves. In my opinion, one of the biggest problems with Sword Art Online isn't even the anime itself. It's the community that has formed around it. The more I look at the fandom, the more I become convinced that a lot of its problems stem from the behavior of the fans rather than the show. What frustrates me is the constant inconsistency. Fans will spend years insisting that the hate train is dead, only to spend the next hour complaining about the hate train. They'll claim critics are irrelevant while monitoring every critical video they can find. They'll tell other fans to stop defending the series because it's pointless, then immediately jump into another argument defending the series themselves. The contradictions are everywhere. That's why the accusations of hypocrisy keep coming up. It's not because people randomly decided to label the fandom that way. It's because the community often says one thing and does another. The gap between the rhetoric and the actual behavior is impossible to ignore. The fandom wants to project confidence, but its actions often suggest insecurity. It wants to act like the debate is over, but it keeps returning to the debate. It wants everyone to believe criticism doesn't matter, yet criticism remains one of its favorite topics. What makes this even worse is that many fans don't seem willing to acknowledge these contradictions. Instead of reflecting on them, they often double down. Every criticism becomes proof that the critics are biased. Every disagreement becomes evidence of a hate campaign. Every negative perception gets blamed on outsiders. The possibility that the fandom itself might be contributing to its reputation rarely seems to enter the discussion. As a result, the community can come across as incredibly frustrating from the outside, rather than openly engaging with criticism or accepting that people have different opinions. Portions of the fandom appear more interested in protecting a narrative. The narrative is that the critics lost, the haters are irrelevant, and everyone secretly agrees that Sword Art Online is great. Whenever reality doesn't fit that narrative, the response is often to explain it away rather than reconsider it. That's why so many discussions end up feeling repetitive. The same talking points get recycled. The same arguments get repeated. The same complaints get made. Years pass, but the conversation barely changes. Instead of growing, adapting, or moving on, the fandom often seems stuck in a loop of defending itself against enemies it claims no longer matter. And that's what makes the whole thing so disappointing. A healthy community should be able to handle criticism without falling apart. It should be able to acknowledge flaws without treating them as personal attacks. It should be able to enjoy a series without constantly fighting over it. When a fandom becomes defined by defensiveness, contradiction, and endless arguments, it starts driving people away rather than bringing them in. That's it for this video. But don't worry, we're nowhere near finished talking about Sword Art Online. As long as the fandom keeps providing material, there will always be something new to discuss. Every time I think I've seen the peak of the contradictions, the defensiveness, or the complete lack of self-awareness, something else comes along and somehow manages to top it. It's actually kind of impressive when you think about it. The funny thing is that people will probably watch this video and immediately prove my point. Some viewers will insist that nobody cares about criticism anymore while leaving paragraphs explaining why they care about criticism. Others will tell me that the debate is over while actively participating in the debate. At this stage, the script practically writes itself. And that's why there is no shortage of content. When a community keeps repeating the same behaviors, it keeps creating the same discussions. When a fandom constantly talks about the haters, complains about the haters, and then insists the haters don't exist, there's always another contradiction waiting to be pointed out. The truth is that Sword Art Online criticism hasn't survived this long simply because critics refuse to let it die. A lot of the time, the fandom itself keeps dragging these conversations back into the spotlight, keeps revisiting old arguments, keeps reviving old debates, keeps turning criticism into the center of attention. Then it wonders why the discussion never ends. So if you're tired of hearing about Sword Art Online criticism, you might want to direct some of that frustration toward the people who keep making it relevant. Because from where I'm sitting, the fandom often seems far more committed to discussing the hate than the critics themselves. With that said, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, there will be plenty more where this came from. Sword Art Online remains one of the most fascinating examples of a fandom that can't seem to decide whether it has won the argument, lost the argument, or is still fighting the argument. And as long as that contradiction exists, there will always be something worth talking about. Until next time, try not to spend too much time arguing with critics who supposedly don't matter.